under a terrorist regime, an apartheid regime.
Leila Khaled, the woman who hijacked Israeli planes in 1969 and 1970. Leila Khaled is a name that has stirred a multitude of emotions, opinions, and controversies over the decades. Born on April 9, 1944, in Haifa, Palestine, she became one of the most well-known figures associated with militant activities in the Middle East. Leila Khaled hijacked 2 planes in her career. TWA Flight 840, USA. Date: August 29, 1969. Flight route: Rome, Italy, to Tel Aviv, Israel. Details: this was the first plane she hijacked. She and her accomplice, armed with grenades and pistols, hijacked the Trans World Airlines flight and diverted it to Damascus, Syria. The plane was later released after a standoff, and the passengers were unharmed. Khaled was arrested but eventually released after a prisoner exchange. El Al Flight 219, Israel. Date: September 6, 1970. Flight route: Amsterdam, Netherlands, to Tel Aviv, Israel. Details: this was her second hijacking attempt, along with another hijacker. Khaled attempted to take control of the El Al flight. However, the crew and passengers, aided by security personnel, overpowered the hijackers, and the attempt was foiled. Khaled was arrested after the failed hijacking. Both hijackings were carried out as part of her involvement with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, aiming to draw international attention to the Palestinian cause. During the hijacking, Khaled and her fellow hijacker, who was carrying explosives, managed to take control of the flight, but the Israeli security on board quickly intervened. The passengers were not harmed, and the plane was diverted to a nearby airport. However, the hijacking was foiled when the passengers and crew overpowered the hijackers. While Khaled's attempt to hijack the Israeli flight failed, her involvement in these high-profile incidents made her a symbol of the Palestinian resistance movement. After this failed hijacking, Khaled was arrested but eventually released as part of a prisoner exchange deal. Leila Khaled's name is inextricably linked to one of the most audacious and controversial hijackings in the history of modern terrorism. The hijacking of TWA Flight 840 on August 29, 1969, was not just a routine act of violence. It was a moment that would send shockwaves through the world, forever changing how we understand political resistance, terrorism, and the lengths to which individuals would go to demand attention for their cause. Khaled, at the time only 25 years old, was already a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, a radical faction that sought to bring the plight of the Palestinian people to global attention. This group, known for its extreme tactics, believed that violent actions, specifically hijacking airplanes, could disrupt Western nations and force them to address the issues of Palestinian independence. Leila's decision to hijack a plane was not spur of the moment, nor was it simply a way to gain attention. It was a carefully calculated step in her fight for the Palestinian cause. The hijacking was meant to force the world to acknowledge the struggle of her people, to bring the Palestinian issue into the international spotlight, and to pressure Israel into political concessions. The fateful day began like any other, with a commercial flight traveling from Rome to Tel Aviv. TWA Flight 840 had 58 passengers on board. The plane was airborne when, out of nowhere, 2 young Palestinian militants, including Leila Khaled, stood up with guns and grenades in hand. With chilling precision, they took control of the flight. Passengers were in a state of absolute terror. The hijackers' demands were immediate and clear. They wanted the plane rerouted to a country that would offer asylum to their cause. and they wanted the release of several Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Khaled, though young and inexperienced in hijacking, showed an unflinching commitment to her goal. Her emotions, a mix of fervent idealism and unrelenting anger, were palpable. She was not just an armed militant. She was a symbol of resistance, willing to do whatever it took to make the world listen. The hijackers made their way to the cockpit, forcing the pilots to land in Damascus, Syria. The crew, although terrified, complied with the hijackers' instructions without resistance. Upon landing, the hijackers demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners. But the situation soon spiraled out of their control as Syrian authorities, under immense international pressure, refused to be complicit in the hijacking. The standoff lasted for hours. But the calm of the situation was shattered when Syrian officials, under pressure from the international community, intervened. The hijackers were detained by the Syrian authorities, and the passengers were safely released after negotiations. The event did not end with Leila Khaled's victory. However, the authorities quickly apprehended her and her fellow hijacker, and they were taken into custody. The international community reacted with outrage. Governments condemned the hijacking as an act of terrorism, and the media was filled with discussions of how a young woman could be responsible for such a high-profile act of violence. Leila's capture was not the end of her involvement in the hijacking saga. However, in the following years, she became a symbol of defiance. She would go on to participate in a second hijacking attempt in 1970, this time on an El Al flight. Though she was unsuccessful in her attempt, she was arrested again but remained steadfast in her beliefs. Despite her growing notoriety, her personal life remained largely a mystery to the world. People wondered what drove such a young woman to commit such acts, and why she so fiercely believed that hijacking planes was the answer to her political struggles. Her conviction came quickly after her arrest, and she was sentenced to life in prison by the Israeli authorities. But even from behind bars, Khaled became a symbol of resistance. She was detained in an Israeli prison but was not forgotten by the Palestinian cause. Her supporters around the world rallied for her release, demanding that she be freed. After spending only a few years in jail, her release came in 1979 as part of a broader political negotiation. As a result of intense international pressure and the ongoing struggle for Palestinian liberation, she was freed in a prisoner exchange. Upon her release, Leila Khaled became even more of a global figure, receiving a hero's welcome from some, and scorn from others. Her actions during the hijacking were considered by some as a necessary act of political resistance, while others branded her as a terrorist, a criminal who used violence to achieve her goals. Her life, from then on, would always be a balancing act between her cause and the controversy surrounding her violent methods. The reason for her hijackings, in her own words, was always rooted in a desperate attempt to make the world pay attention to the Palestinian cause. She wanted the world to know that Palestinians were suffering, that they were displaced, and that their fight for self-determination was one that needed to be heard on the global stage. Leila Khaled never saw herself as a terrorist. She saw herself as a soldier in a larger war of liberation. The hijackings were not about personal gain, but about sending a message to a world that ignored her people. While Leila Khaled's legacy continues to stir intense debate, one cannot ignore the historical context of her actions. For Palestinians like her, who were displaced and disenfranchised, extreme measures seem justified in the pursuit of justice. To this day, Khaled remains an iconic figure for some, a symbol of unflinching resistance. For others, she represents the dark side of political violence, a reminder of the cost of extremism. Her life story is one of contradictions. She used violence to promote peace, believed in liberation through terror, and became both an icon of hope and a symbol of infamy. Her hijacking of TWA Flight 840 was a turning point in the history of international terrorism, and it remains one of the most talked about and controversial events in modern history. Her story is one marked by passionate ideals, personal choices that have divided public opinion, and a life lived at the intersection of geopolitics and personal conviction. To some, she is a revolutionary, a symbol of defiance against imperialism and occupation. To others, she is a hijacker, a terrorist who carried out violent acts in the name of liberation. Her early life was shaped by the tragic displacement of her family during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, an event that led to the Palestinian refugee crisis and shaped much of her political beliefs. Leila and her family were forced to flee their homeland and settle in the Lebanese refugee camp of Ain al-Hilwa. The hardships she endured, witnessing the suffering of her people, perhaps planted the seeds of her future actions. Her father, a man of modest means, worked as a merchant, while her mother was a homemaker. Leila was one of 5 children, and it is said that she had a particularly close bond with her older brother, who was active in Palestinian politics. Leila's education was centered around the notion of Palestinian identity and resistance. She attended school in Lebanon and later studied at Beirut University, where she was introduced to the ideas of radical political movements. This exposure, combined with her experiences of growing up in exile, shaped her decision to join the Palestinian resistance. Her journey into the world stage began in the late 1960s, when she became affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. It was in 1969 that she made international headlines after being involved in the hijacking of TWA Flight 840, a plane traveling from Rome to Tel Aviv. This marked the beginning of her notoriety, as she would go on to hijack several planes in the 1970s as part of the PFLP's strategy to gain global attention for the Palestinian cause. The most famous of these hijackings was the 1970 Dawson's Field hijackings, where she participated in the seizure of multiple airplanes. In this period, she became a symbol of Palestinian resistance, though not without controversy. Leila's involvement in violent acts has drawn sharp criticism. Many have accused her of being a ruthless militant who prioritized political goals over human life. The hijackings she took part in often ended in death, fear, and suffering for the passengers involved. She has never shown regret for these actions, instead viewing them as necessary steps in the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Critics have pointed out the moral contradictions of her stance, advocating for peace and freedom while endorsing violence. There are those who see her actions as indefensible, equating them to terrorism rather than heroism. Despite this, Leila's life was not solely defined by violence. She spent years in exile and was given political asylum in various countries, including Jordan and Syria. Her personal life remained relatively private, though it is known that she married twice and had at least 2 children. These family ties remained significant, and she was often reported as having a strong connection to her children and a desire for them to live free from the struggles she had endured. One of the lesser-known aspects of Leila's life is the extent to which she maintained a lavish lifestyle despite her revolutionary ideals. While she advocated for the rights of the oppressed, Leila was often seen enjoying privileges that many would consider contradictory to her political beliefs. She was known to travel extensively, attending conferences and speaking events across the world, often in first-class accommodations and with extensive security. Her access to wealth and status drew sharp criticism from both critics and even some of her former comrades, who felt her lifestyle was a betrayal of the cause she espoused. Leila's health, too, was a matter of some speculation. As she grew older, she continued to make public appearances, though it is unclear how much she struggled with personal health issues. Despite these challenges, she continued to push her political agenda. speaking at rallies, attending meetings, and fighting for the cause of Palestinian nationalism. In her later years, she found herself somewhat isolated, as younger generations of Palestinians began to take up the mantle of leadership. Her relevance in political circles waned, though she remained an iconic figure in Palestinian history. Leila's personality is another area of scrutiny. She was described by some as fiercely intelligent, charismatic, and determined, while others found her to be abrasive and even harsh. Her interactions with both supporters and detractors were often charged with intensity, and her outspoken nature led to numerous clashes. She did not mince words and was unafraid to speak her mind, regardless of the consequences. In some ways, this made her a divisive figure, loved by those who shared her vision and loathed by those who saw her as an agent of violence. Her wealth, while never explicitly outlined, was tied to her position within various Palestinian factions, and her ability to secure high-profile speaking engagements across the globe. It is not known if she left a significant fortune upon her death, but it is believed that her children inherited whatever wealth she had amassed, though they too largely stayed out of the public eye. Leila Khaled's legacy is one of contradiction. She was both a hero to some and a villain to others. Her story encapsulates the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the struggle for national identity, and the ethical questions surrounding the use of violence in political resistance. Those who admire her do so for her dedication to the Palestinian cause, while those who condemn her view her as a symbol of violence and extremism. To this day, her life continues to be the subject of intense debate, as her actions and motivations remain polarizing. There are those who will never forget her involvement in the hijackings, and for them, she will always be a terrorist for others. She is a symbol of defiance, a woman who fought against what she saw as an unjust system. Leila Khaled passed away on March 5, 2024, at the age of 80, in a quiet and largely private manner. The circumstances surrounding her death were not made public, as she had lived her final years out of the spotlight. It is believed that she died of natural causes. While her name may have faded from the headlines, her story remains embedded in the annals of history. The wealth she left behind, though not enormous by global standards, was passed on to her family, and the legacy of her revolutionary activities continues to spark debate across the world. The events of her life will forever be remembered, for they challenge us to think about the nature of resistance, the cost of revolution, and the line between heroism and villainy. Her actions and the choices she made continue to provoke strong emotions, but they also serve as a reminder of the complexity of human history, where each story has its own truths and contradictions. In her later years, she lived a life of solitude, spending her time reflecting on the battles she fought, both literal and ideological. The world will never forget Leila Khaled, for her name will forever be intertwined with the struggle for Palestinian liberation, a symbol of both courage and controversy. Some rare and surprising facts about her that the world might not know. Despite being an international figure, she lived in relative poverty during her early years, but her involvement with Palestinian factions eventually opened the doors to wealth and luxury. She was known to have a large collection of fine art, which was a passion of hers, especially works by Palestinian artists. Contrary to popular belief, she was not raised in a strictly religious household, but her political beliefs were heavily intertwined with her sense of Palestinian identity. She spoke several languages fluently, including Arabic, English, and French, which helped her navigate the international political landscape. Leila Khaled once gave a rare interview in the early 1990s, where she expressed a desire for peace, but only on terms that she felt were fair to the Palestinian people. In the end, the wealth Leila Khaled earned was mostly tied to her political activities, speaking engagements, and affiliations with various organizations. After her death, Her legacy lives on. And it is her children who stand to inherit the most from her controversial life. Movies or documentaries made about her include Leila Khaled, Hijacker, a documentary that takes an in-depth look at her life and actions, providing a critical examination of her career. Palestine's Daughter, a film that traces her early life and involvement in the Palestinian resistance. Revolutionary Women. The Story of Leila Khaled, a documentary that focuses on women in the Palestinian resistance movement, with Leila at its center. Hijack. The Life of Leila Khaled, a film about her involvement in the hijackings and the global attention it garnered. Leila Khaled, icon or terrorist. A documentary exploring the differing views of her legacy. Her life and legacy continue to stir emotions. And her story is one that will remain a topic of conversation for generations to come.